Welcome everyone to CVI Now's live virtual event all about CVI and math. If you're with us on our CVI Now parent group, drop a hello in the comments and feel free to post questions as they come to you. I'm Rachel Bennett, the Content and Community Manager for CVI Now here at Perkins School for the Blind, and I'm a CVI mom. We know how difficult math concepts can be for some of our kids with CVI. So many visual skills and visual processing skills go into math concepts such as one-to-one counting, number sense, time, equations, and so on. We also know that our kids are very capable and have workarounds for so many tasks in life. So how can we approach math from a strength-based perspective, one that incorporates multisensory learning and CVI adaptation supports and accommodations? I am beyond excited to introduce our expert today, Matt Tejan, who is one of my favorite people in the whole world. Matt is an education consultant and teacher of students with visual impairments in Connecticut. Matt is a leader in the CVI field. He developed the What's the Complexity framework that enables educational teams to evaluate and address barriers to a visually accessible school day. Matt also created the 2D image assessment, a tool that evaluates what your child's most accessible 2D images are for learning. Matt is passionate about teaching families and educators about CVI and partnering with them to create CVI-driven educational programs. So after his presentation, which is going to run for about 90 minutes, this is really kind of the first big presentation about CVI and math. So we have a lot to talk about, and Matt has done a lot of wonderful work. And after his presentation, he's here to answer your questions, ones that were already submitted and ones that come up live. So here we go. Take it away, Matt. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
All right. I'm going to share mine. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Make sure this works out here. Okay. All right. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I love the CVI Now website, and I'm just really excited about what Perkins is doing to help the field move forward. So I'm just happy to be a part of it. I'm going to make this full screen. And thank you to all the parents out there who are taking your time this afternoon to tune in. I really appreciate it. And it's really going to be, I think, from your questions in general, that our field is going to move forward in our understanding of how to support kids with CVI in the area of math. All right, so my presentation is entitled CVI and the Math Mind. And before I really get into it, I want to share a clip from one of my favorite movies, and I'll explain why in a second. The clip's like a little over a minute. It's like a minute and a half. And here it is. Gonna get us pumped up for math, I hope.
Oh, that, yeah. We were singing, and we were learning. We were learning in sing-song.
I should just pause for a second. For anyone who hasn't seen this movie, it's School of Rock with Jack Black, and he's impersonating an elementary school teacher. He's in a rock band, he's not really a teacher, and this is the principal walking in to try to see if he really knows what he's doing.
Huh. What are your methods?
Yeah. I find that it's really helpful when you're teaching the subjects that are the boring subjects.
Huh. Well, you don't mind if I just sit in on your class this afternoon, do you?
No, come on back this afternoon.
It is the afternoon, I meant now. So please, just continue with your method.
Yeah, okay. Math is a wonderful thing. Math is a really cool thing. So get off your ass, let's do some math. Math. 3 minus 4 is...
-1.
That's right. And 6 times 1 billion is...
6 billion?
Nailed it. And 54 is a 45 more than what is the answer, Marta?
It's 9.
Yes, I was testing you. It's 9, and that's a magic number.
Okay. So I thought that would get us maybe excited about doing some math on a Friday afternoon, because I'm going to ask all of you to do a little bit of math in a minute. But first, I just thought I wanted to say that, you know, one of the things that I always think about when I watch this movie is never impersonate a math teacher. And so when I was asked to do this presentation, that was my first thought, is I don't want to give the impression that I'm trained to teach math as a math teacher. So I'm not a math teacher. I'm not an expert on math teaching strategies either, but I've worked with a lot of great math teachers and a lot of great students and families. And I think that collaboration is what the things I've learned in those collaborations, as well as in my own reading and research, is going to be what I'm going to share with you today. And I'm not an expert on the brain either. I've read a lot about the brain and how that relates to CVI and math and different things. But just keep in mind when I'm presenting these things, I'm presenting what I've learned and I'm sharing it with you. And hopefully as a field, we'll get a lot further than what I'm showing here and a lot more specific into how CVI impacts math specifically. So I'm a teacher of students with visual impairments and also a certified special education teacher. That was my background before I became a TVI. And I'm, like Rachel said, I'm really passionate about teaching and supporting kids with CVI and their teams, their families. And I'm always trying to learn more about CVI, about the brain, and about effective educational approaches. And I'm really excited to share what I've learned with you so far, kind of like bring you up to speed on where I am on my journey of learning about math and how it relates to CVI. And just also that presenting on math is a new territory for me. This is the first time I've ever done it. So I really appreciate you tuning in. So just a few core beliefs that I have that I think relate to this presentation. First is from one of the researchers that I'm going to be citing quite a bit. Let's see, Stanislas Dehaene, I think is how you pronounce his name. And he says that a theory of education could only be derived from the understanding the mind that is to be educated. So I think it's so important to have some sort of concept and understanding of what might be happening in the brain of the students we're teaching, even though we can never know for sure for each particular child. Second is that every mind and every person is unique. And then the last is that there's no such thing as a math brain. This comes from Dr. Joe Bowler. He's the developer of the mathematical mindset, which you may have heard of. And the theory used to be that math is like this fixed sort of, you're either a math person or you're not a math person. And that's kind of like, you know, the hand you get dealt or something. But now we know that there's so much neuroplasticity. We know about the growth mindset and about how the mind changes, the brain changes and adapts to learning and intervention. And so there's no such thing as a math brain. Even in the parts in this presentation where I spend time talking about what I think might be the sort of the neurological underpinnings behind some of the deficits in math that we see in kids with CVI, please always keep in the back of your minds that my conviction 100% is that even if that's where we're starting, that's not where we're ending. And that's just a starting point for education and for growth. Okay, so in this presentation, so this is a brief, like sort of general outline of kind of where I'm going to take you for the next 90 minutes. So first, I want to talk a little bit about how math happens in the brain based on the reading that I've done. Second, why CVI can make math difficult for some children. And then keeping in mind that full potential, that neuroplasticity that's always there. And then with that in mind, talking about promising practices that may help kids with CVI learn math. And then next steps. I'm going to have a slide at the end where we talk about next steps for the field and where I think would be really helpful if we go as a field. All right, so let's do some math before we go any further. I'm going to show you a series of tasks on the screen, and I'm just going to add, it's going to take only like a minute, and I'm just going to ask you to try to solve them. Okay, they're all math problems. All right, so here we go. Which quantity is greater, A or B? And if you want, you could type it in on a chat or something. You don't have to. Just in your head, just think of the answer. Okay. Which quantity is greater now, A or B? Okay. Now I'm going to ask you to subitize, and what that means is rather than counting, It's looking at it's looking at a number of items like, you know, 1 or 2 or 3, and being able to tell at a glance how many numbers are there without actually counting. So I'm going to flash it for like a millisecond and see if you can see how many. Okay, did everybody get 2? Probably, right? I'm guessing you saw 2. Now I'm going to show you one more and see how many dots are going to flash on the screen here. Okay, my guess is that even in that brief millisecond, we all probably, my guess is that those of you who are watching out there probably got the answer 3, right? And that would be the correct answer. That's subitizing. That's knowing how many are there without even consciously counting. All right, now the quantities are getting closer. Which one has the greater quantity, A or B? It gets a little harder, a little bit less automatic, but you can still do it. And then finally, match the quantity with the correct number. I don't know, I can't tell if my subtitles are showing up over the numbers, but just real quick. So there's a 4 and a number 3, and you would look at the quantity and match it to the number, okay? So what we just did there in that quick series of tasks was we took a little short trip along the path of math development in the human brain. Okay, and here's, from what I can gather from the research that I've been doing, this is sort of the path in a rough sense that math development takes. So we are born with an innate number sense, which scientists describe as a gift from our evolutionary past, right? If we're looking at if we hear a crack of a branch in the woods and we look, it's going to be very helpful to know if there's 1 wolf or 6, right? So we have that innate sense of gross quantity from birth, scientists believe. Now, infants can discriminate how many sounds they are hearing and match it to a visual set of objects of the same number. So hearing 2 sounds and seeing 2, you know, teddy bears or something, infants can actually do that task. In a recent study showed that 3-year-old children can discriminate which group of M&Ms are larger as long as there is a significant difference between the group. They'll go for the larger group. So we have this sense of numerosity from very early in our lives. It's kind of ingrained. Now, as we move from toddler to preschooler, the number sense becomes more finely tuned to more precise quantities. So in the tasks I just showed you, when I said which one is greater, at first one group is huge, the other group is small. As we get older throughout early childhood, we start to be able to tell when they're only just a little bit difference in size. We can still tell which group is larger or smaller. And then young children around, you know, preschool to kindergarten age start to be able to subitize small sets of numbers like 1, 2, and 3. By the time children are going from preschool to kindergarten, the number sense is becoming so precise that they can now distinguish 2 from 3 from 4, even if there's no label yet, even if they don't have the verbal or written label to go with that quantity, they can tell that a group of 4 is greater than a group of 3. When the number sense becomes that precise, children are then ready, we're then ready to learn the labels for these quantities. What word goes with 4 objects? It's FOUR, right? What's the written number look like? What's the symbol look like that goes with these specific precise quantities? And then we start counting these quantities from small to large, right? From 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. We start counting. And in the early elementary years, we start to form a visual number line from left to right in our minds that's going to be one of the bases for our future math development. So scientists are saying now that the number sense is now considered to be one of the major domains of human competence, and that the number sense is really, it's something that we develop almost incidentally through observation at a very young age, observation of the world and the events around us. And then in sighted individuals, development of number sense relies heavily on our visual system. Okay, so for some people, such as children who have CVI, the number sense may not come as naturally and as incidentally. I know that many of my students require intentional, thoughtful instruction and scaffolding to support and develop that number sense. And I'll show some examples later. But let's begin with a review of the visual brain and talk a little bit about CVI and about where I think the development of number sense, where that overlaps. So many of you may be familiar with this diagram of the brain, the dorsal stream, the ventral stream. Basically, what it does is it just shows the 2 main the two main streams of visual processing in the human brain. So if you were looking at a pencil here and the image goes back to our retina and travels through electrochemical impulses back to our occipital lobe in the back of our head, that's our primary visual cortex. That's where some of the heaviest, earliest visual processing happens. But what we're seeing still doesn't mean anything when it's in our occipital lobe. It's got to travel through a vast amount of networks in the brain in order to give meaning and understanding and processing to what we're seeing. And we organize those connections into two major streams. There's other ones too, but these are the two major ones that we talk most about. One is the dorsal stream, and that's the flow of information from the occipital lobe to the parietal cortex, motor cortex, and frontal lobe. And it's a two-way stream. The information is going back and forth. And then the dorsal stream is really helping us with our visual spatial sense. It's often called our where stream. Where is something in space? Where am I in space in relation to other things? It helps us do things like handle simultaneous visual information, being able to see a lot at once. Simultaneous sensory information, being able to look and listen at the same time, or look and touch at the same time. And it also helps us use vision to guide our motor actions. Now, our ventral stream is the flow of information from our occipital cortex to our temporal lobe. And of course, there's all these other connections too, places like the amygdala, the frontal lobe, but really we're kind of focusing on occipital temporal area for now, and then up to the prefrontal cortex. So in the ventral stream is often considered our visual library, or our what system. When we're looking at a face or an object or an image or a number, can we identify what that thing is? It's like Christine Roman calls it our visual library. And I love that analogy. Now, what about math? So I was reading some neuroscience research articles on how, and actually a book that's really good too, that's going to be in the references, about how math develops in the brain, specifically that early math, the number sense, quantities, counting, the internal number line, things like that. And here's what I'm finding. So scientists are saying that the seat of number sense and quantity is in our parietal cortex, part of the dorsal stream. And so when we develop a sense of the number 2, the quantity of 2, in our dorsal stream, in our parietal lobe, in our ventral stream, that would be where we would first start recognizing the numeral 2 or the written word 2. Okay, but at some point, the written word 2 or the written numeral 2 and the quantity of 2 have to come together. Okay, and so scientists are saying the place where that happens is the prefrontal cortex. And that's where early on, the quantity for 2 and the written symbol for 2 come together and are joined together. Okay, and then eventually, which really surprised me because I always think of the ventral stream as the only place where we identify things. What really surprised me is that I've read in some of the literature that the after the symbol for 2 and the quantity for 2 are combined, then we start to also eventually recognize written symbols, written numbers in our dorsal stream, in our parietal lobe, in addition to in our ventral stream, because it's so close to the area where we think of quantity. So just fascinating, and it just goes to show you, like, this is a very simplistic sort of gross overall model of how this would work, but really the connections are so intricate. And if you look at Lotfi Merabet's studies that he's doing at Harvard Medical School, it's so much more intricate than this, but this is a kind of a basic way to understand it. And speaking of Dr. Merabet and his CVI neuroplasticity research group, they're doing some fascinating brain imaging of students with CVI. And what they're doing is, this is not a functional MRI machine. It's not a structural MRI. What this is, and I always worry I'm going to mess this up, but it's diffusion tensor tomography, I believe that might be the name for it. But in essence, what they're doing is they're using the water flow, the flow of water molecules in the brain, to map out actual pathways, the connections between the different areas in the brain. And what you're seeing here is the brain of a control subject, a teenager without CVI, without any visual impairment. And all this color that you see here represent the visual networks in that person's brain. And what always strikes me about this image is that it looks like a whole brain almost, right? To me, it just shows how much of the brain is involved in visual processing. So right here, you've got the occipital cortex, right? The back of the brain. you've got the dorsal stream, which is the parietal lobe, motor cortex, frontal lobe. And then down here where my pointer is now, you've got the ventral stream, occipital temporal. Now, next I'm going to show you an image of the visual connections in the brain of a child similar age with CVI. Okay, and so you see the occipital connections back here, occipital temporal area, pretty well connected, not maybe as much as the control subject, but you see there's a lot of underconnectivity in the dorsal stream for this person in that parietal, occipital parietal area. So when we're thinking about that model, that ventral dorsal stream model in the brain, Gordon Dutton and his colleagues have helped us understand what are the most common patterns of visual impairment when it comes to those streams of visual processing. And they say that the most common pattern of impairment in kids with CVI is to have both dorsal and ventral streams affected in some way. The second most common is to have just dorsal stream impairment, just the dorsal stream impacted and maybe not the ventral stream. And then the least common is to have just ventral stream impairment and not any of the other challenges that would come with dorsal stream impairment. And that's going to be important as we look at how scientists think math develops in the brain. So math is built in the visual brain for sighted individuals. And as Dehane writes, the parietal cortex, and I put in parentheses, the dorsal stream, is the place where quantities and symbols meet. The parietal cortex is the foundation of mathematical learning. And I just found this study here fascinating. So as a vision educator, as a TVI, I've known, reading Dutton's work, reading Christine Roman's work, reading the neuroscience literature, I've known that when we attend to the left side of visual space, our right parietal area is active. And it's active in giving attention and awareness of that left side of visual space. When we are attending to the right side of visual space, our left parietal area is active. So it's a little bit different from visual fields. It's more of an overall ability to attend and be aware of what's in that area. Now, what was fascinating to me in going over the research on math development and how math can be so visual is that when we do subtraction or think of subtraction or hear a subtraction problem and they do a functional MRI on you, it's when you're thinking of a subtraction problem, it's your right side of your parietal lobe that's active, as if you're actually envisioning the left side of visual space because you're decreasing in value, you're going to the left. If you're doing an addition problem, which would mean spatially, conceptually moving to the right along that imaginary number line, your left parietal lobe is actually active in the functional MRI machine, showing that there's this deep-seated visual spatial understanding of quantity and math that's ingrained in us as we develop math throughout childhood. So we have this internal sense of number line in our parietal cortex or our dorsal stream. It's part of our dorsal stream. And when we do math, we visualize that number line as occupying the left to the right side of space as quantities increase. So what might the implications be of that for some children with CVI? So these were some patterns that I've been seeing for years in my kiddos with CVI, which is what got me so interested in learning why might this be happening. So many of my students would have difficulty counting, right? They would double, triple, or quadruple count some items in an array. They would miss other, come up with an incorrect answer. Many of my students have difficulty recognizing numbers. For some of my students, it's numbers and letters, but for others, it's just numbers. And I was always wondering, I never could quite figure out, why that was. Many of my students have difficulty with word problems. And I had this sense that it had something to do with the ability to visualize a word problem as they're reading it. And then finally, well, that's not finally, difficulty judging quantities. So, if you say, give two piles of objects or two pictures of dots and say which one is greater, that can be very difficult for some of my students. And then finally, difficulty recognizing shape. Anywhere from basic shapes like squares, rectangles, circles, all the way up to multi-dimensional pyramids when it comes to geometry in middle school and things like that. So I was always wondering, what, what's I always sensed that there's got to be something visual underlying some of these problems, some of these difficulties that my students were having. So, and I consulted the research on children with CVI and math skills, and here's what I found. Nothing, right? I couldn't, I searched the web, I searched like university library that I have access to, and some really great stuff would come up as far as materials people have created. Maybe some teachers have posted it on a blog, or maybe some parents created some really effective and creative math books or something for their child that other students can use too. But I didn't find anything as far as like research, or here's some overall approaches, or here's what we know about CVI and math. And that was very disconcerting to me as a new TVI, as an educator trying to help my students. It was hard to know where to begin. So this is what I started realizing. I realized that I would need to turn to the neuroscience field for research on how math is impacted when there's a brain-based visual impairment. And by that, I mean usually in studies on adults, not children. But then take those studies and combine that sort of clinical information with my knowledge of the educational approaches of CVI, the CVI characteristics, the CVI range, Dr. Roman's work, Dr. Dutton and Amanda Lueck's work, to try to see where there was overlap, and then use this combined knowledge to help my students with math. So before we move forward, I just want to give a couple of caveats. So a lot of the research, actually almost all of the research that I've read on math in people with brain-based visual impairments, I feel like it's very, very, very applicable to children with CVI and to their difficulties with visual complexity. But I also want to make sure we're all thinking of this, that we need to be careful not to over extrapolate that research and draw conclusions for the children that we're working with. And here's why. If you look at this bottom bullet point here, the visual brain, the visual brain in children with CVI, we think of it differently than we do for adults who have acquired CVI or elements of CVI later in life. And so these next couple of statements are from the book by Joseph Zill and Dr. Dutton, but they say that when we're talking about a child with CVI, the visual brain is impaired more diffusely. It's impacted more diffusely usually. When we're talking about adults, many times we're talking about like a tumor or a stroke or something that's a little bit more localized, and you get sort of this pure visual agnosia, this pure visual difficulty where everything else visually is still intact. Where with kids with CVI, the visual impairment tends to be more global than in adults. But the positive side of this is that in children with CVI, there's also way more plasticity in the brain than there is in adults. So a lot of times you might see an adult in this research with a pure version of some visual deficit where they can only see one object at a time, or they can never recognize a face. Whereas with kids with CVI, often you see more subtle versions of that, where they can see many objects, but just maybe not as many as their brother or sister. Or they can recognize some faces, but not all, So a lot of times it's not as sort of pure of a deficit, and there's much more room for plasticity and growth and improvement in children. Okay, so and another thing that I always like to stress for me is that I always bring whatever I'm looking into in different fields, like neuroscience, or like I'll show you later, dyscalculia and things like that. I always want to sort of filter it through my CVI lens and bring it back to the CVI characteristics. This is my favorite framework for understanding and educating my students. And so basically what I've written here is the 10 characteristics from Christine Roman's CVI range assessment. And basically I've just circled the ones that I'm going to focus on for the next part of the presentation. I want to take a close look at math, and specifically how difficulty with complexity of array can cause some math difficulties, and how difficulty with complexity of the individual target can cause math difficulties. And then how we can use different strategies or different promising practices to help with that, specifically color, right? We know from Christine Roman's work how powerful color can be as a visual support. And I want to show in this presentation specifically how I found it helpful for kids with CVI when it comes to math. Okay, so in general, some of the challenges I'm going to talk about are in the left column here. In addition to the two types of complexity, I want to talk about difficulty forming visual imagery, which is really something I'm noticing, but not something I've done a lot of research on yet. And then also processing time or visual latency. And then for supports, we're going to talk about color. We're going to talk about reducing complexity through spacing and masking, multi-sensory approaches, ways you can support students for developing visual imagery, the importance of meaning and motivation in math tasks, and then also a little bit on processing time. Let's start with complexity of array. Okay, difficulty with complexity of array. It's one of the CVI characteristics from the CVI range by Dr. Christine Roman. And here's what we know about it as TVIs. That's sort of our starting point. Children with CVI often have difficulty with the complexity of the visual array. And that includes finding items in clutter, like a toy in a toy box, doing a busy worksheet, reading connected text, because text is really just a lot of symbols cluttered together, finding a target against a complex background, finding an item in the fridge or a grocery store shelf, or even finding a familiar person in a crowd. Those are just some of the many ways that this characteristic can manifest itself. Now, according to most of the literature and most of the research, that this difficulty is primarily due to higher order dorsal stream impairment. Because the dorsal stream is what really helps us with simultaneous visual processing. And in the neurological literature, the term it's called is usually simultaneognosia. Agnosia is Greek for just not knowing, and simultan is derivative of simultaneous, right? So simultaneognosia just means difficulty seeing simultaneous visual information. Okay, so throughout this presentation, I have a little thread where you'll see these titles called Demystify Cvi. And to me, what that means is even though, while we always want to honor the complexity of CVI, how each child's brain is different, and about how no matter how hard we try, we'll never fully know what it's like to see from our child's or our students' standpoints, each individual. But at the same time, I think sometimes CVI can seem so mysterious to people that it almost blocks us from trying to understand how certain aspects of it might feel or might look. So here's one example. If you try to find Waldo in this picture here, my guess is you probably can't because it's pretty small here, but also if you could, it would probably take 5 minutes at least to find him. But what something like a Where's Waldo picture shows us is that we all have limits for how much simultaneous visual information we can process. We all have a threshold. And when the amount of information goes above that threshold, it's just visual noise after that. Kids with CVI have that threshold too. It's usually just for smaller sets of information because of the CVI, okay? But so I think it's important to keep that in mind. It's a threshold, and usually a threshold of someone without CVI is a higher amount of visual complexity. But what might that look like? What might the equivalent of a Where's Waldo scene? What might that threshold be for certain kids with CVI? Well, for a child who is this was from one of my students who's in phase 1 of Christine Roman's CVI range. And we were doing this Clifford book box one day that I had made. We got the Clifford Rakes Leaves story, and I had like the Clifford stuffed animals in it, all the different characters. We had like a little rake, we had like some leaves, we had a couple of different things from the story. And at first I just had Clifford out there with the black background, and the black work tray. And my student was looking at Clifford. When I get to the part in the book where it would say Clifford's name, I'd pause and say like, hey, where's Clifford? Let's find Clifford. And he'd look at Clifford and smile. When it got to the part where Clifford started raking leaves and I put the leaves there, he stopped looking at Clifford. And what I found out as I got to know the student more, I realized looking back that it was one object was perfect for him where he was with how much he could process at once. As soon as I added more objects, more clutter, it became too much. It was like, Where's Waldo, I think. Where's Waldo for another one of my students who was in early phase 2 at the time was this lunchtime setting right here on the table. He was going to eat lunch and he had learned to use visually guided reach to pick up his cup, to pick up his spoon. But on this occasion, they didn't have like the trifold board up, his black trifold board. And I noticed that he was feeling the table to find his spoon. And I thought, well, that's okay. I mean, that's a good strategy, except that he doesn't need to do that strategy because he can, as long as complexity is controlled, he can use his vision. during that. And so we put up the trifold divider and I showed the staff how he was then able to look at his spoon and reach. But that was without that modification, this scene right here was kind of like his threshold for how much simultaneous visual information his visual system could handle. And for one of my kids in phase 3, who was a senior in high school, this exceeded her threshold for visual complexity. This worksheet, or not worksheet, this Venn diagram for her civics class. And sure, it's complex, but it didn't exceed the complexity threshold for anybody else in the class. You know, her peers were able to get it. They might have been annoyed that it was so cluttered, but she just couldn't do it. We needed to work together to modify it. All right, I want to show a quick video about simultaneognosia. Okay, so from my opinion, and from my standpoint of the research that I've done, simultaneognosia is like the clinical correlate term to what we call complex difficulty with complexity of array in the CVI range language and literature. And I want to show you a quick video clip of a man who developed simultaneognosia later in life due to an injury to his dorsal stream. He had bilateral occipital parietal issues, which led him to only be able to see one object at a time. And I'm just going to pull up the video here. And I'm going to fast forward.
Grab it with that hand.
I want to show.
Touch it with that hand. Can you reach with the other hand? Wiggle it. Just move it. Yeah, it does a little.
Okay. The man's going to hold up a comb and a spoon and say, which one do you see? I'm going to turn my volume up just in case, but if you can't hear it, I'll also summarize it afterwards too.
What do you see here?
A comb.
Mm-hmm. What do you see now?
Comb.
What do you see now?
Spoon.
Do you see the comb?
No.
Do you see the comb?
Yeah.
Do you see the spoon?
Mm-hmm.
What do you see now?
I see the spoon.
What do you see now?
Comb.
Do you see a spoon at all?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so he was unable to see, despite the fact that there were two objects there, he was only able to see one at a time. And he could see either of them, just not at the same time. So very interesting. What a sort of, sorry about that, my phone's ringing. Turn it off. But just what an interesting look at what a sort of pure form could look like. It's funny. Or that, anyway, when my computer rings sometimes, when my phone rings, it's very strange. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. But so imagine being only able to see one thing at a time. Well, individuals with simultaneognosia, it's usually not as pure as that individual. And when kids have it, it's much more general, like you see in many of our students with CVI. The child, if they're out of phase 1, can see more than one thing most likely, but maybe not more than 6 things, or maybe not more than 7 things. And from what I can tell, it's directly related to this concept of simultaneognosia in the dorsal stream. And so a lot of times people with simultaneognosia will look at a visual scene and only pick out a piece or two, an element or two, and miss the overall connection of everything that's happening in the scene. And so just as a quick example, when I showed this picture to one of my students in phase 3, when she was in middle school, I said, what do you see here? You know, no context. I just showed her the picture on my iPad. What do you see here? She said, I see a tree lying on its side. And I kind of waited for her to elaborate and say what else was happening in the picture. And then she didn't. So I said, can you tell me more about this picture? And she kind of hesitated and looked again and said, well, I guess it's a big tree. So then what we did is I drew a little 4-quadrant grid over this picture and had her explore each quadrant and tell me what was in that quadrant. And then she said, oh, there's a house here. Oh, that looks like a car. I see a windshield. Oh my gosh, the tree fell on the house and the car. I hope everybody's okay. You know, so she had the ability to understand what was going on in this picture, but she wasn't seeing the whole picture at first until we systematically walked through it together. So to me, that's simultaneognosia. That's one glimpse of what simultaneognosia can look like in a student with CVI. And to me, it's directly related to difficulty with complexity of the visual array. Okay. Okay. So let's see. So in order to judge, let's go back and look at some of these early math tasks that we did that represent sort of early formation of number sense. If we're going to try to judge which set of something has more, we have to be able to see more than 1 or 2 dots at a time. And on top of that, we have to be able to see, not only do we have to be able to see all the dots in each set, but we also have to be able to see both sets at the same time. So if you have difficulty with complexity of array, or if you have simultaneognosia, you could see what the difficulties might be in that task. What about the impact on subitizing? Well, if you can see one thing at a time, you wouldn't be able to subitize 2 or 3 things, right? If you can only see 2 things at once, you wouldn't be able to subitize 3 things. So let's take a second to try to demystify this concept again, and think about that we all have a threshold for what we're able to subitize, for what our brain is able to sort of take a snapshot of and immediately know how much is there. And for most adults who are typically sighted, it's like 4 or 5, the number 4 or 5, we sort of get lost and start making errors. So let's try to subitize the next quantity I'm going to show you. It's going to flash on the screen really quick, and I'm going to ask if you could say how many dots are there. You ready? 1, 2, 3, go. Okay, how many dots, right? If that was 1 or 2 or 3, you'd know right away what it was. But that was probably more like 8, I think, something like that. So that exceeded our ability to subitize. So I think sometimes when our students with CVI see 2 or they see 3 and they're unable to subitize it, one possible explanation is that just like that example exceeded our threshold for being able to subitize, for some kids with CVI, maybe the numbers 2 or 3 exceed their current ability to subitize. So people also with simultaneognosia tend to have difficulty with counting. So there's a fascinating study I've been reading by Dehane and Cohen. And what they were studying 5 adults with bilateral lesions in the occipital parietal area or dorsal stream. And these individuals tended to produce piecemeal descriptions of complex pictures, right? That sounds familiar. That's what I see in a lot of my students in the work we do with pictures. They miscounted often, usually counting some items more than once and missing other items. And the errors grew as the quantity increased. And I love this quote. One of the patients said, "I know there are many, but I only see one." Right? And to me, that captures what difficulty with complexity of array or simultaneognosia might mean for some of our kids with CVI. I know there's some more there, but why am I only seeing one, you know? So the study went on to say that the reason for the counting difficulties in these patients was a direct result of their occipital parietal lesions or their simultaneognosia. Due to simultaneognosia, they had difficulty applying spatial tags to the items that they had already counted. So as a result, they were unable to tell and label internally which items they've counted already and which items they hadn't counted yet. And that's why they were skipping some and multiply counting others. So let's look at a few of my students with CVI, and I've changed their names for this presentation. But so one of my kiddos, when he was in kindergarten, he's in middle school now, which is, I can't even believe, but when he was in kindergarten, and he's doing some pretty awesome math, but let's look at when he was in kindergarten. His paraprofessional would put out manipulatives, quantities like this. There's 6 here. You see 6 dinosaur manipulatives in a random array. And she'd ask him, "Can you please count this?" And I don't know, hopefully you could see my yellow cursor a little bit here. I should have thought to make it bigger, but I'm gonna sort of use my cursor to sort of show the pattern of counting that he would use at that time. He would do something like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You know, he'd count some multiple times and he would miss others. And because of that, he would usually get the incorrect answer. I had another student named, I'm going to call Kara for this presentation. And the first time I ever observed her, we were in her classroom and their kids were doing math. And she was sitting at her desk attempting to count the dots on a tens frame. And she was, doing a similar pattern of double counting some, miscounting others. Sometimes she would lose what line she was on, and she would go from like halfway across the first line down to the second line and just get kind of lost, right? And her teachers were sort of not understanding CVI. She wasn't, I don't even believe at that point she was diagnosed with CVI, although she is now. They sort of attributed it to an intentional or behavior problems, or she just doesn't really focus and she's not trying. But I'm looking at this and I noticed some of the patterns I was seeing, like with Aiden and my other student, and I'm thinking it's very similar, I think. And I'll show you what helped these students in a few minutes. Same thing with Maya, only with her, it was unifix cubes. And I think she was in, maybe when I started working with her, maybe first, I think it was first grade, and she was trying to count these unifix cubes, and she was doing something very similar. You know, she was missing some, she was skipping some, double counting others. And then finally, my final example is with a student who I'm going to call James, who we got his district assessment back, and he got several problems wrong. And this was one of them that they showed me. And the captions might be, I don't know if they're covering this part or not, but oh, you could see there's A, B, and C, and he circled C, but it was the wrong answer. And when they showed me this, I wasn't sure whether, like, I didn't know at that point what his patterning skills were for coming up with this pattern, but I knew for sure, based on my CVI range assessment of this child, that there was no way without visual support he was going to be able to count this complex array of dots. He was capable of counting that, but with the right visual supports. And so I knew that since it wasn't adapted, this was not a true test of his cognitive ability. So what might help? What might help these students? That was sort of like the quest that I was on to try to figure this out. And really what helped me more than anything was the color support strategies taught by Christine Roman. But first, let me turn back to this study by Dehane on the patients with simultaneognosia, and we'll see how some of these things, we'll see what helped these patients. So they reported that the patients did better when they had more time, right? So latency, right? Visual latency, when they had more processing time, they did better. Participants made fewer errors when the items were arranged canonically. That means like in a rectangle, like on a dice, you know, kind of in a canonical shape, or linearly instead of randomly. And then finally, this is the one that really stood out to me. Participants performed better and counted almost as well as the control subjects when each item was a different color. And I thought, oh, color is a support. I started to think about a lot of my students. And this is sort of the summary that Dehane gives in this study. And I think it's really important and really applicable to many of my students. The core deficit of simultaneognosia is a failure in using spatial tags to refer to individual objects. Because all of the rectangles in our quantification task were physically identical and were distinguished only by their spatial location, it is perhaps not surprising that a simultaneognosic patient had difficulties knowing which of them remains to be counted. However, this also suggests that counting performance should improve considerably if we were to differentiate the counted items using features other than spatial location, and color is one example. So let's look back at those 10 characteristics from the CVI range, and I'm going to focus on color now as a support strategy that's helped a lot of my students with these skills. And specifically, we'll look at color right now as a support strategy for difficulty with complexity of array and math. Okay, so let's go back to Aiden, trying to count those arrays of dinosaurs. Well, his paraprofessional was brilliant, and she knew how color was a support for him in other areas of his life. So without me even being there, one day she decided she'd cut a strip of black paper and she arranged the items linearly in an alternating color pattern on the strip of paper, and boom, like magic, he was able to count accurately. And what we realized was that, and I didn't have the language for it at the time, but she was sort of using linearity and color to help him tag which ones he's already counted and which ones he hasn't counted yet. And it worked. So by the time, that was one of my first experiences with this. So years later, when I got to, it's funny, I can't see her name and I forget what fake name I gave her. Oh, Kara. When we got to Kara, and she's trying to count the dots on the tens frame, I already sort of knew this alternating color pattern had worked for some of my other students. So we started making some tens frames and modifying them in different ways. And the one that worked best for her was to start with like a green highlight, so she knew where to start, and then to every other AB color scheme, so she could keep track of where she was, and then a red highlight, that's where you're going to, that's like your end point. And she was, and also if you noticed, we increased the size of the grid relative to the dots, so it increases the spacing between dots and it minimizes visual complexity. So this worked for her, using color in place of spatial tagging, and also using color to organize her visual approach. That whole idea of going left to right. Unifix cubes, probably not surprising at this point, but Maya, by alternating every other color, Maya was able to count a lot more accurately because there was a way to tell, other than spatial, information, which ones she'd already counted and not lose her place. All right, and then going back to James with this, this whole district assessment thing, what we realized by sitting back down and going over some counting tasks with James is that if we gave him anything he could make a mark with, particularly a colored mark, like a marker or a dot paint marker or a stamp, anything like that, as long as he dotted or marked the things as he counted them, he was able to count accurately and not lose his place because he was using something other than spatial information to code and tag which ones he had counted already and which ones he hadn't counted yet. I love the Counting Bear app. This app helped Kara a lot. We started using this with her. And of course, like, everybody, each person with CVI is an individual. So it's not going to be appropriate for every kid. But for where she was at that moment with 2D, her ability to look at 2D images and her ability to count, we tried this app with her. And what I love about this is that it shows things. Things aren't always represented in a linear array. So you still have to use visual search and look around and try to find what you haven't counted yet. But the great thing is that it gives you visual tags for what you counted. Each thing you point to, it fades the object and it gives you the number over it. So she could tell, she'd still have to use that visual spatial, like looking around and covering the whole array, but she had support in doing it. Okay, so here's some other tagging strategies for counting that I found helpful with my students, kind of a summary. Making each item a different color, using alternating color patterns like AB, AB, using visual marks like checks, dots, magnets, stickers, stamps, you name it. Anything the student would have fun marking the items with can be a form of this. Using bins, using tactile bins to like have a bin for all the items that he hasn't counted yet, and then he picks each item out of the bin and puts it into another bin as he counts. And if that can go from left to right, that would be even better because it's, again, reinforcing that left to right continuum as you count. And then finally, having the student count a set of different things rather than all the same thing. So the people that did that study remarked that because the rectangles were all the same, that was one reason why people kept making errors. There's no way to tell what they hadn't counted. But instead of maybe having a student count 3 identical dinosaur manipulatives or bear manipulatives, maybe see if they'd rather do better counting a bear manipulative, a paperclip, and an eraser or something, different things that would also give that sense of, okay, I've already tagged this one, I've already counted this one. And again, I just want to emphasize this demystifying thread again of that, what might it be like to not be able to count because we can't apply enough spatial tags, visual spatial tags. Well, look at this rectangle of dots here and just take a minute to try counting them. You can use your finger if you want and see how far you get. Let's give it a shot real quick. Even if you're on your cell phone, just try to get in there and try to count a third of it. Just see what you can get to. Okay. All right, so I think probably by now you've seen that you can't do it, right? Without and I'll bring up the text here, but so each of us has maybe a certain amount of, to use the analogy, a certain amount of folders in our brain that we can sort of use to keep spatial information in, right? Like, okay, I've already done this one over on the left, I've done this one in the middle, now I got to do this one on the right. We have like those folders in our visual spatial brain, right? That sort of help us file that information. But a certain number of spatial information, it's going to exceed those folders and spill out of them. And it's going to become too much for us. So this is an example where there's too much in this random array for us to use our visual spatial tagging system to keep track of what we have counted and what we haven't counted. It's probably the same thing for a lot of our children with CVI, but just with smaller sets. Okay, but possibly the same feeling for a similar reason. It's just that the thresholds are different. So I just like the example of a grocery list too, right? I think that in this picture, this man has a grocery list. He's in a supermarket. And I think the most important thing in this picture is his pen, right? You ever been in the grocery store, you've got a written list of like 20 items and you forget something to mark it with? And like, you got to keep looking at your cart and being like, oh man, I think I got the tomatoes. Wait, are they here yet? And you're sort of like just lost on this big list, right? That's because we don't have enough spatial tagging folders or whatever you want to call them in our dorsal stream to keep track of all that when it goes above 4 or 5 or 6, right? So we have to use something else to tag what we've already done. It's the same type of way I think a lot of my students struggle with CVI to count, similar reasons. We all go through that kind of thing. And I think that by trying to take that perspective, that helps me be like, oh, that's what he might be going through. Let's see if we try this. I know this would help me for my threshold. Let's see what helps him for his threshold. So we have just seen how difficulty with complexity of array can impact sort of that foundational development of math skills. And we have explored some possible ways that we can support that. And we'll explore more later when we get to the multisensory stuff. But what about now how complexity of array can impact the more immediate like visual access in the moment to math work? I see those as sort of two separate things, like an iceberg, where the tip of the iceberg out of the water is like, you know, can the student access this piece of paper right now? And then the bottom of the iceberg, the bigger part is more like, what is CVI's overall impact maybe on that person's development of number sense, visual spatial information and stuff like that. So let's look at the tip of the iceberg for a minute. So, you know, if you have difficulty with complexity of array or simultaneognosia in the clinical literature, then that's going to impact the amount of information that you can look at once and process at once on a book or an iPad or a worksheet. And it can, too much can make it easily visually inaccessible. But we can still use color coding, blank spacing, masking, and simplification of complexity to help kids with this. So let's look at some examples. I'm not going to dwell on these slides, but I just want to show you. There's this book on visual thinking in math that I was skimming through and reading chapters in. But I love this section right here where the author kind of takes us through a task analysis of all the visual spatial tasks required to do a basic multi-digit addition problem. And just like, I'm not going to read through it, but just take a quick glance at it maybe and kind of look at a couple of the items. Right? Something that we've maybe learned and done for a while, we might take for granted the visual aspects of it, but it's a lot of visual demands right there just to do a 2-digit math problem. And he says that in order to do a problem like this, you need certain visual perceptual skills are required if you're going to do it as a sighted individual. So you have to have perception of shape and orientation so you can recognize numbers and distinguish 9 from 6. Perception of position in a right to left sequence so that you avoid confusing 81 and 18, right? Perception of vertical alignment in order to avoid confusing the 10s and 1s, you know, getting the place values correct. And then finally, perception of horizontal alignment so that if you have a problem like 3 + 2 = 5, you're not getting the 5 and the 3 and the 2 kind of all jumbled together and mixed up. You're sort of seeing that progression of left to right. So what I've noticed is that everyday math calculations and operations pose significant visual spatial demands for all of us. But due to difficulty with complexity of array, many kids with CVI seem to struggle with these demands. And here's just some ways that we can use color coding. I'm going to show some examples of how we've used color coding with some of my students to help with this and to reduce complexity. So here is, you know, one of the great things about my job, besides the families and the students, is some of the great teachers I get to work with. And Denise Romeo is one of them. She's a special education teacher, and she works with one of our students in phase 2. And I mean, like everything across the board that she does with this student is pretty remarkable, but I'm going to focus on a few math materials today. So this is just one example of where she's teaching the student about quantities by using color, right? So each set is a different color, so she can better sort of like group each of those items into a set and not get them sort of jumbled together or mixed up. She's lining them up linearly to help with that spatial aspect. And then she's using the red marker to move across. So starting at 1 and 1, both sets have 1, both sets have 2, move the red marker, both sets have 3, move the red marker again, this set has 4, but this set doesn't. And to help the child compare those two groups in a very much more visually accessible way. We can also use color to help students develop a sense of columnness, whether it's in a hundreds chart or whether it's in this student's daily calendar. Right? We can use color to take something like these general math problems on the left that might be too complex, too squished together, do one at a time and use spacing and use color to sort of make sure things don't kind of jumble together, and to also help that left to right sort of like, okay, I've got my plus sign, I've got my green equal sign, I've got my blue target where I put the answer, to help so those numbers don't kind of squish together. When we have more complex middle school type problems like this, for one of my kids in phase 3, it's the same type of principle. It's using color to decrease visual complexity and organize visual space. First, what we do is we cut out the problem so it's only one at a time. But unfortunately, with this problem, even one problem has a lot of visual information. So what we would do is use color coding to help her see the related visual elements of that problem. So the height here is pink. The height on the trapezoid is pink. B1 in the equation is blue. Whoops. The length of the base 1 on the trapezoid is blue, to help with that the visual organization of processing this visual space. I had a student in high school in phase 3 who had a really hard time with the black and white TI-84 graphing calculator. And I tried giving her a really big one, a huge black and white screen. And she goes, "Mr. Tejan, it's still black and white. Can't you get me something in color?" And this was like, 7 years after I'd been working with kids with CVI. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? So I asked the math teacher, I said, wouldn't that be great if there were a calculator like the TI-84 that could like color code everything? And she goes, well, I've got one in my closet. It's called the TI-84 Plus. And so she goes and gets it. And this is the TI-84 Plus. It's amazing. So it color codes the lines so they don't run together for my student and she doesn't get them mixed up. And it color codes the data sets that go with the lines. So using that, which was standard size for her, because her acuity was okay. She didn't need it really bigger. She needed it color coded in her situation, and it worked really well. So using color to organize visual space when it comes to mathematics. This was for another one of my kids in phase 3. The math teacher was about to hand this out to his students, and he had just gotten out of one of our trainings on using color coding to help kids with CVI, and he did this with it. And it worked perfectly for that student, just sort of organizing the information based on color. One time I went after school to work with my high school student, and we were about to start our lesson, and she said, well, hold on, Mr. Tejan, I meant to ask you, I've been having difficulty with my molar mass notes, finding molar mass. Can you help me? And I said to her, well, yeah, first let me ask, what's molar mass? Right? I had no idea what she was talking about, right? I mean, she's like telling me about molar mass and its chemistry, and she understands the concept. But when her paraprofessional, who was taking the notes for her as my student listened to the lecture, it wasn't highlighted. It was all black and white, and she couldn't follow the parts of the equation. She was seeing little details here and there, but couldn't process the whole thing. So we got out a bunch of highlighters, and for a good half hour, we made photocopies of the problem or the notes, and for about a half hour, just tried different color schemes until she found one she liked. Then we told the paraprofessionals, and that's how they color-coded these notes for the rest of the semester. This is by one of the fantastic paraprofessionals that I get to work with. Her name is Felicia Edwards. And this is just something she did for a student. She modified an assignment where, 36 plus 41, where do I put the 10s? They're blue and blue. Where do I put the 1s? They're green and green. Where do I write my sub answers? And then where do I write my final answer? Awesome color coding, very simple for this particular student. It was the perfect amount of visual complexity for them. All right, so a little bit of this demystifying again. We all have limits in our brain's ability to handle visual complexity, and we all use color to help to some degree. And I'll show you some cool examples. So we like this visual design is so saturated throughout our daily lives that we don't even realize most of the ways that it's helping all of us deal with visual complexity. Our remote controls, right, usually have color-coded buttons on them because it's a complex array, and they want to make their products as visually comfortable to navigate as possible. So they use color coding, spacing, shape grouping, all these visual strategies to help us organize that visual array. Same thing when we turn on the TV, we got this channel guide, right? It's organized by color and spacing to help us process that visual information so that it doesn't exceed what we're able to do visually in a comfortable way. If this subway map were in black and white, I probably couldn't look at the orange line and in one single glance know where it starts and finishes, right? I have to probably trace it with my finger and figure out where it's supposed to end. Visually complex array, but the designers have used color coding to make it more visually accessible. We all use color coding because we all have thresholds for how much complexity we can handle. So color coding, what I'm finding more and more is that color coding in a lot of educational circles is considered best practice for all students. And this is an example from one of the top educational math websites out there, Khan Academy, right? When we were home, like when we were all in quarantine last spring, and we were doing all the learning together at home, he had lots of different, distance learning math programs that he was doing. There was let's see, iReady, there was Learn Zillion, there were all these different games online, but then there was Khan Academy. What I noticed about a lot of the other ones, except for Learn Zillion and Khan Academy, was the complexity. They were so complex, things bombarding you, shapes and robots and characters and cartoon drawings. And it was so much to look at once. But Khan Academy, more often than not, like you see in this problem here, had a black background, had very vivid, highly saturated colors, and used color coding in almost the exact way that I would use it for some of my students in phase 3, because they know that it helps everybody. And they want to take the visual difficulty out of the math problem so that any kid can focus more on the content. All right, this is from a math teacher who, to my knowledge, is not involved with CVI at all, but just again, that universal aspect of color. Color coding, she says, can support mathematical thinking in that it can help students organize their thinking, make their thinking visible to others, and make connections. It also can strengthen visual representation to aid students in internalizing their learning. And here, whoops, here we go. Here was an example that she gave on her blog. This looks a lot like what I've done for a couple of my kids with CVI before when it comes to like, as long as the complexity is okay for them, how do we use color coding maybe to organize this complex array of information? Same with this slide, very similar. And I just like what the teacher says here. I love to color code in math. Why? Because it's a way to enhance visual representation. And she calls herself Mrs. Math. I love that. But the point here is to show that this is a universal thing. And I think sometimes really stressing that to teachers too helps them realize that they already know some of this. Like it sort of makes CVI seem a little bit less mysterious. Like, oh, I already know how to color code for kids. And now I understand why I have to do it for Johnny. And I'm going to start doing it. I mean, that's why I like showing these. And I love this one too, just like these manipulatives. She's got one group plus another group, and then the colors represented after the equal sign. Love it. All right, so we talked a lot about difficulty with complexity of array. Rachel, do you mind giving me a time check real quick? I had to turn my phone off so I didn't keep ringing through the computer.
You're okay. We're about a little over an hour in.
Oh, good. Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so let's move on now. We talked about difficulty with complexity of array and how that could impact math. What about the other CVI, another CVI range type of visual complexity? And that's difficulty with complexity of the target. That's like when we're looking at one thing, can we interpret what it is? Okay, just a quick review of this again. What I showed you before, we were just spending a lot of time talking more about quantity, more of that dorsal stream complexity of array stuff. Now we're going to talk about written numerals, more of a ventral stream complexity of the target kind of thing. Okay, so many children with CVI have difficulty with complexity of the visual target. And that can mean lots of different things, from not only being able to look at complex or abstract objects, but also being able to interpret them, being able to interpret objects, images, symbols, letters, words, numbers, etc. And it's a ventral stream, largely a ventral, even though we know all the areas of the brain are very highly connected, we attribute this in general to a ventral stream function. And in the literature in the clinical and neuroscience literature on brain-based visual impairment, it's often called different types of agnosia. Visual form agnosia, apperceptive agnosia, associative agnosia, and things like that. And I think that's important to know, only because if we don't see research out there that already is in the educational field on CVI, and we need to look to the neuroscience field, I think it's very helpful to me to know where the overlap in the language is, because then if I want to find out about difficulty with complexity of target and identifying numbers, I search on my university library thing there, you know, things like agnosia and math difficulties and things like that. All right, so color helps children with CVI see form. It's in general. That might not apply to every child, but that's a general support strategy that a lot of people have used. And it's based on the research in the neuroscience field. So here's what I mean. We can all use color as a stimulus with forms, right? It helps us with the perception of forms, especially for patients with CVI. This was from research that's out there that's cited there. And when, therefore, I should back up, I forgot to mention something. Research shows that most people with CVI can still perceive color. You know, that it is possible to have loss of color vision due to brain-based visual impairment, but it's very uncommon. You know, it's more common in an ocular way. So sure, a kid with CVI could still have color blindness due to an ocular reason, but it's very unlikely that a child with CVI, or I should say it's less common that a child with CVI has color blindness due to their CVI. And in the early research that was happening with like Groenveld and James Jan back in the early 90s, what they were seeing is that kids had that color vision intact, but they had a lot of difficulty with form and identification of things. And what they had theorized at the time was that we could use that relative strength of color perception to help children perceive forms by highlighting the object in that form or highlighting the word or the letter in that form. And Christine Roman, I think, took that little tiny bit of research or theory and just really expanded it to show how many ways we can use it to help kids with CVI. And here's just one example of her bubble outlining technique. I've had some students learn to read without using this. I've had a couple other students who learned to read, and it seemed like this was completely all they could read for a while until they got enough sight words and were able to then start fading it. But it was really crucial in some of my students' ability to learn sight words. But anyway, it's that ability to it's that idea of sort of using color to try to accentuate form and show our students the form of something. And Dr. Roman Lancy also has a lot of good material on how we could do that with letters and numbers. And so, for instance, in chapter 2 of her book, CVI Advanced Principles, there's a lot on how to like use color highlighting, use comparative language and the language of salient features to describe the shape of numbers, the shape of words and things like that. And there's even there's a great little table in there that shows the numbers. I think it's either 0 through 9 or 1 through 9. And it talks about how some ways that we can describe those numbers. And of course, it could be different for each child, but it's more of like an example. And it has different salient feature language in there. And I should have also mentioned, I forgot to put it here, but you see how I outlined the number 3 here. And then over here, you've got the outlines without the numbers on the right. I used a tool that's online right now called the Roman Word Outlining Tool or Roman Word Bubbling Tool. And there's a link to it on Paths to Literacy as well. But you can use that tool. It's a free app. And you can use that tool to input any letters, numbers, words that the child might be working on and automatically adjust all the outlining, make outlining, change colors, all that stuff. So it's a really, really powerful tool. I should say too that I'm in addition to the visual ways that students might be able to learn numbers, that whole multisensory tactile approach can also work really well too. I've had 2 students that I can think of that have used like those, you ever see those number cards with the sandpaper-ish numbers on them and you kind of feel them and see them at the same time? In addition to stuff like this, where you've got like the bright outline and stuff, they also use cards like that where you could feel the numbers too. And for 2 of my students in particular, that ability to tactily explore the numbers really seemed to help them. So that's just something to think about. And then there's a lot of tactile and multisensory methods for learning letters and numbers out there that are really meant for every kid, whether they have a visual impairment or not. And I feel like there's probably, by mining that gold mine of information that's out there, we can come up with other tactile ways and multisensory ways that we can use for kids with CVI too, to help them get the visual and the tactile forms of numbers and letters. When it comes to like when it comes to having difficulty perceiving forms and shapes and identifying what you're looking at in CVI, there's also can be a big problem when it comes to geometry and when you start getting into shapes and things like that. And when I say problem, I don't mean an insurmountable one. I just mean something that it's important that educators are aware of how CVI can be contributing to this, so they can think of some visual ways and some multisensory ways to address it for the child. So this was an example of a test question that my kid in phase 3 in middle school had, and she had to find the volume of this prism. And you could see that it's a complex thing. There's lots of lines here. There's lots of space inside the lines. And what I was realizing is that my student was having difficulty judging which lines were the same length, which lines were parallel to each other, right? And you need that information in order to fill in the missing dimensions here. So what I realized through a lot of trial and error and collaborating with that student, trying different things, is that when we used color coding to show her which lines were parallel and which lines were the same length, she could then fill in the missing information and solve the problem. But before that, it was just like a bunch of lines, as she described it. Like it was just a jumble of lines to her. But when we used color coding, she was able to see the relationships between the lines better. And then if we would use grid paper for her to write out her answers, so that she could align the columns and everything and not lose track of place value. And then we'd always have for a while, this little, like a little outlined area for her to put her answer in, so she could keep track of the answer without too heavy of burden on her visual search. All right, so back to the 10 characteristics, we just talked about ways that we could use color to help with complexity of target when it comes to math. And those are just scratching the surface. I mean, I think those are just some examples that I used with some of my individual students. I think in addition to using these visual accommodations or visual approaches or strategies, I think a multisensory approach I found to be really, really helpful with my students. So research shows that a multisensory, going back to that study of the individuals, the adults with simultaneognosia that had trouble counting and performing math tasks, when those individuals were given the same math tasks, only either with manipulatives like pennies or marbles, or with in the context of things that meant something to them, like the person's daily schedule and things like that, and asking them to do the same types of addition and subtraction and counting, then the individuals performed much closer to the control groups than they did when it was just abstract, 4 take away 3 or 5 plus 6. When it was 5 pennies plus 6 pennies, it was much easier for the individuals. So I thought that was fascinating. So research also shows that this is, I thought this was just so heartening and fascinating to see. Research shows that seat of number sense in the parietal area, I've been talking so far about how visual it is, right? But research also shows that it's multimodal. It's not just visual. So what that means is that when we're developing that number sense in our parietal lobe, that sense of quantity, that number line, that visual spatial sense of math, it's also taking input from all the other senses to learn about numbers. It's taking tactile input. It's taking auditory input to learn about numbers. The research is showing that when an individual hears the number 2, when the individual hears a bell rung 2 times, and they see the number 2, or they see 2 marbles, it's being processed in that same parietal area, that same quantity area of the brain, whether it's visual, tactile, or auditory. So I think that's just another argument for why the multisensory approach is so important. So for kids with CVI, what are some things that I feel like we could use manipulatives and models and auditory information to help with? Well, these things can allow a student with simultaneognosia or complexity of array to explore a quantity sequentially rather than expecting them to always do it simultaneously. And from what I can gather, I mean, that's how people who are Braille readers, I mean, they're learning a lot of this stuff sequentially. And I've worked with Braille readers who are phenomenal at math, and they've learned it a whole different way than sighted individuals were. We can use manipulatives to allow a child to experience what it feels like to hold 3 items at once, not just see 3 items at once. We could do both. We could look at the 3 items at once. We can hold the 3 items at once. We can separate them into bins and count the 3 items sequentially. And I also feel like, we can use manipulatives in the physical world, the tactile world, to compensate for the difficulty with spatial tagging by moving and sorting objects as they are counted. We can develop a sense of number line from left to right by having lots of manipulatives-based games and activities where we're working left to right. And we can also we can also help a child what they're confirming. I'm sorry, we can also help a child confirm what they're seeing in 2D, like say a really complex, geometry figure, by making 3D models of it and showing them what dimensions those lines are meaning to represent. Okay, so here's some more work from Denise Romeo, the fantastic special education teacher who I was telling you about before. And she's using, for our child in phase 2, she's doing a lot with all the senses, which is one of the things I love about her lessons. So I wouldn't even be able to do her lessons justice, and it would take a whole nother presentation. So I'm just showing you snapshots of some of the materials and how they cater to the different senses for this child. But here are, I can't tell if you can see my menu or not, so I'm just going to move it. So here is an example of some pegs that she likes to use because of the colors, the simple single color pegs, and she can stack them to show quantity of sets. And so again, she's stacking them. She's using the black background, very simple. She's stacking them in different colors, so you can sort of group one set and group the other set. And then she's putting the red visual markers on top to show that student a sense of this one ends here and this one ends higher, to show that sense of lower and higher. And then the tactile aspect of it is she'll, when the student's looking at 3 pegs, she'll give the student 3 pegs to hold, or a bag of 3 pegs to hold versus a bag of 5 pegs, and sort of to see the difference, to squeeze the bags. She's very into the multisensory approach. And this student went from somebody who didn't really like math that much in the past to somebody who loves math right now. She'll also take pictures of her work on the iPad and then use markup apps to show the student certain concepts and help her compare the 3D to the 2D. And then in addition to that, she's often also incorporating the auditory sounds of the numbers that she's presenting into the presentation. She'll ring a bell to go with the number that's being presented to help reinforce the auditory perception of those sounds as well. Here's a quick example of using a model to help a student understand a complex 2-dimensional image. So this was a real question on a test for one of my students. And first of all, I can't even imagine the diagram in letter P here is an optical illusion. You can see this in many different ways. So I don't even understand how this was given. Like you can, anyway. But this was really this is a bunch of lines and shaded spaces on a piece of paper. And my student was supposed to be able to see dimensionality and see a 3D object here. But it was clear from going over it with her that that wasn't really happening. So we made her models of it that she could look at and feel and explore and compare. We didn't abandon the 2D, but we would show her the model, have her explore it, and then compare the features of the model to what she was seeing in 2D. This was a test question too for that same student, and it was asking her to mentally manipulate these shapes to decide what it would look like. I mean, that's like a visual, that's a visual manipulation and imagery task that I didn't feel she had at the time. But I sat with her and we went over some practice problems, and it was clear to me that it wasn't a visual spatial activity that she was capable of at that point. Doesn't mean she couldn't build it, but she just wasn't, there was a disconnect there. So again, we made models of it because she was cognitively capable of showing this concept, but it's just that this was visually inaccessible to her. This was accessible, and she was able to use these on the test to show which one was the right answer. I also feel that this same student, like a few other of my students in phase 3, seem to have what seems to me like difficulties developing visual imagery for either text that they're reading or listening to, or in the case of math, word problems, right? So let's just take an example like this, where a basketball court in the park is 50 feet by 100 feet. How many square feet is it? Now, what would you picture if you heard that problem? In my mind, I might not be picturing a basketball court, but what I'm probably picturing is some sort of rectangle, like a vague rectangle with 50 on one side and 100 on one side, and I'm doing that problem spatially. Well, this problem was presented to my student in writing without any imagery to go with it. But we found that by giving her simple imagery to go with it, like not a whole basketball court with all the complexity and the baskets and the lines, just a simple sort of like model of the shape of a rectangle with the 2 dimensions on it. And then it took that whole need to visualize it out of the equation. And she was able to show that she knew how to do that type of problem. So when we're talking about a multisensory approach, or when I'm talking about it, I feel like when we're talking about it for kids with CVI, it's important to mention that sometimes the tricky thing to try to figure out when it's a child with CVI is what if the tactile modality is best for activity A and activity B, but then what about the visual aspect? What if they're not giving enough visual opportunities throughout their day? So Christine Roman and I just published a little book called Sensory Balance Approach for CVI, and it's through Perkins Press. And I want to bring this up just because I feel like it's basically the way that we've shown our thinking as far as how that whole need for tactile and auditory support for kids with CVI, for a lot of kids with CVI, and also that need for visual development and visual opportunity don't have to be conflicting priorities. How we can balance them, like in Melissa, in the example of the student that I just gave above, I'm calling her Melissa here, but where we had to build the 3D model, she was still primarily using her visual modality to look at the test, to read the problems on the test, to look at the diagram. And she was still looking at and exploring visually this 3D object, but she also had the aided benefit of using her tactile sense to explore it as well. So often what I find with my students is that it doesn't have to just be tactile or just be visual, but often when there's a combination of them, it might not be able to be all at the same time. It might have to be one at a time, sequentially, one after the other, like maybe first the visual, then the tactile, then the visual again. But it just seems for a lot of my students that approach has helped, sort of balancing out the sensory demands. I just found this fascinating, that research that I mentioned, that we can hear math too. We can sort of in the same area of the brain where we see math. And I just want to show a quick video of this sort of playing out here. Let's see. So there's an app that I really like called Doodlebuddy. And I'm just going to pull. So what it is you can put, this is just some dots that I put on there. You can put any picture on there. You could create something and import it into it. But what's nice about it is that it allows, there's hundreds of different stamps or stickers, they call it, for a student to pick. And they all look different and they all make a different noise when the student presses on the screen. And I've had so much fun with this app for so many different games and activities with my students that can be completely customized to their interest and their ability levels. And what I like about it is that it uses, not only you can use the stamps to visually tag what you've already counted and keep track, but the auditory input that it gives you is often very engaging for my students, and it helps them get that auditory sense of how many they're counting too. Let me just play a quick. And this is just me demonstrating. Okay, that's a Doodlebuddy app, and it's just, what I like about it is that it's so customizable that I can have so many students with individual differences in learning, but still use this app with so many of them because you could do so much with it with such a simple platform. All right, we're getting toward the end here. Make it meaningful and fun. That's like one of the things I'm always striving for. And if a student's ever off task during one of my sessions, or if they're just not liking math, usually what I'll think of is like, math is probably really difficult because of the visual issues, and they're probably working really hard or trying to work really hard. But if I have not made it fun, if I hadn't made it relatable and it's kind of boring for them, to me, the harder something is for any of us, it's got to be motivating and rewarding and fun. Otherwise, like, why do it, right? So I think, making it rewarding, meaningful, and fun is how we all learn. And I think if you have a student who's struggling with math, I think the more meaningful and relatable and fun we can make the lessons, the more likely they're going to be able to grasp it and learn it. So we know we all learn better when we understand why we are learning something and how it applies. In the studies by Dehane, patients with simultaneognosia were able to count far better when it was based on their daily schedule, coin manipulations, etc., when they realized how it related to their daily lives. And then making it fun, like, so playing, having fun plays a critical role in our learning. And there's research out there about this. This is just one little nugget that I pulled out of that. When we have fun, our brain releases dopamine that makes us more motivated to repeat the task and aids in attention and memory, right? So like, there's so much, so many of my students have like little areas of passion and interest that they love. Like I have a student who loves Corvettes, Batman, The Simpsons, Disney, football. These are all different students, and they have like these these particular students have these really intense interests. And I see these interests as like these amazing windows into being able to jump into their world a little bit and like play in that world, you know, and we can play with using math, we can play using literacy, but we can use those things. Like to me, if a student loves Corvettes, but they don't like math, I would make every lesson about Corvettes. And like, then we're doing math by accident almost, you know, I mean, it's just like, why make it boring? You know, I think there's always a chance to make it somehow meaningful and fun. Maybe not all the time, you know, but like in general, to have enough activities that are fun so the person has a positive outlook toward math. We can use games, songs. I have a few students who love to role play, so we're always being goofy and role playing. I'll show a quick example here. So this is a case study for a student that I'll call DJ. And I was working with his team, and we were kind of trying to figure out, he was sort of at a crossroads in his math education. He was getting up to like multiplying 2-digit with 1-digit, adding 2-digit to 1-digit numbers, and they would show him an index card like 32 plus 8, and he'd have to point to the right answer. And he was able to do some of them. It was frustrating for him, though. It was a little challenging. He would often push the cards away. It was very clear to us who knew him well that he didn't like it. And he just wasn't like, you know, semester after semester, just wasn't really meeting this goal. Well, then one day we were setting the table for lunch, and we asked the student, can you get 4 spoons and set the table? And he wasn't sure how to do it. You know, he could tell you that each person needs a spoon. He understood cognitively like every person needs a spoon, but when it came to actually that quantity of 4, what does it mean physically in the real world? It's like he hadn't really had a chance to practice that in an intentional, guided way yet. And so I would talk to the team, and we thought maybe we need to make math more readily relatable to what he's doing in the real world, and to really go back to some of the basic understanding of numbers and how he can use numbers in his everyday life to be more independent. And so we actually started by, he was such a blast to work with. And I wish I still had him. He ended up moving, but he loved to role play, right? So we had always been doing fun, goofy things with role playing in our lessons. So when it came to like, how do we make math more fun and motivating and make the quantities more meaningful, we figured, well, he loves to role play, he loves being silly, and he also loves pirate's booty. So we decided he went out to eat with his parents a lot. They would go out to eat in a certain restaurant a lot, and he'd talk about it. So what we decided to do was pretend we set up this role playing scenario where me or the other teacher would be the waiter. And when it was snack time, he had this little menu, we called it, and it was basically a strip of black paper with a few numbers on it at a time. It might say 2, and then 4, and then 6. And we'd come over to the table and say, hello, sir, can I help you today? And you wouldn't like pirates. Our special today is pirate's booty. You know, that's all we ever had. And we'd say, how many would you like? So he'd pick a number, and they were arranged in order from left to right on like his menu. So we get that sense of less and more going left to right. He'd pick a number and hand it to us. And then we'd read the number with him. Oh, what number is this? It looks like you picked 4, right? And he could read like individual numbers like that. And then the waiter would go behind the scene, bring back some pirate's booty, put the black tray to the left of the student's plate, and say, all right, let's count them up. And the student would take one at a time and count them as he put them on the plate. And then if we got it right, he would give us a tip. And if we got it wrong, he would complain to management. So it was just this funny, like goofy thing that we had going, but he started liking math, you know, and it was just like, it was some of the most fun lessons that I've ever done. This is another game this is one of Denise Romeo's games that she's playing with our student in phase 2. And I wouldn't do it justice in the short time that I have left, but I just want to say that basically it involves each player gets one of these cubes here, and she gets to pick what color she wants her cube to be each time. And then she rolls a dice on the screen, and it shows like the dots for the dice. So you've got that canonical layout of the quantity that she's seeing. And then she'll hear the number either through the bell ringing 5 times or through the teacher counting the dots and going boop, 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 like that. Not saying the numbers, but hearing the quantity. And then she'll say, okay, the student will have a bin of pegs, and Denise will say, okay, let's count the pegs for the number that you're seeing and hearing. And she'll count the pegs and put them in a different bin, each one as she counts. And if she counts the right peg, she gets to move her cube that amount. But if she undercounts, then her opponent gets to move to the correct amount, and she's sort of like behind. And she loves this game. And it also sort of helps teach this sense of left to right, this whole quantities increase as you count from left to right. So just incorporating auditory, visual, tactile in the context of a game that the student likes. So before I start to wind down and conclude here, one thing that I've noticed in the research is that I think as a field where there's very little, if any, research on how math impacts our students, I think we're going to have to start by drawing from other fields where a lot of research has already been done, and not just sort of trying to apply it as a one size fits all, but saying, here's what this other field has discovered. How might that relate to some of our kids with CVI? And what might that tell us we need to look into in research? So I noticed in a lot of the research I was doing that there seems to be some overlap between CVI and dyscalculia as far as what types of math difficulties have and potentially where the origin of those difficulties lies. So dyscalculia really means having a disproportionate difficulty with number processing and math. And the hypothesis that's been out there for a while among scientists is that the parietal lobe quantification, that dorsal stream quantification system, is at the root of most of dyscalculia. And it's recently been vindicated by imaging studies that show that people with dyscalculia it seems like they're affected in that same parietal number sense area that would be in the dorsal stream. Furthermore, there's been another study that came out this year showing that individuals with dyscalculia actually have a lot of difficulty compared to control subjects with visual complexity. They call it visual crowding, but that's what they're talking about, is visual complexity for people with dyscalculia, and that a lot of the roots of their difficulties may lie in the difficulty in developing number sense and quantity that comes from having difficulty with visual clutter. And they say in there needs to be more research in this area, but it just gets me thinking, like, what if I looked into the educational practices that help people with dyscalculia, just to sort of see what's been done and see if I think some of it might apply indirectly to some of my students. And when I looked up educational practices for dyscalculia, some of the themes that I saw repeatedly were using color coding, using manipulatives, using game-like formats, giving extra processing time. So, a lot of the things that I was already doing for a lot of my students with CVI. So it just gets me thinking, I don't know what we can take from this field to help us move our field forward in this area, but there's been a lot of research in this field already, and it seems like there's some areas of potential overlap. So just something to think about. And then finally, potential, right? I've spent some time talking about brain deficits and how that can impact your ability to do math, but it's important to really stress that, like I said in the beginning, that's just the beginning of understanding where our kids might be struggling, but it's far from the end. In the end of his book on the number sense and how the brain develops number sense, Dehane makes a point of saying this too. He says, unlike adult brain lesions, the child's brain presents a large degree of plasticity, and even severe deficits can often be overcome with intensive remedial training. And then this last quote, kind of lengthy here, he says, in the case of dyscalculia, much research has demonstrated the beneficial effects of programs that focus precisely on children's exact cognitive deficits. Brain imaging before and after training shows that a considerable degree of recovery, both within areas that were originally underactivated, like the parietal area, and in additional compensatory circuits, particularly in the right hemisphere. So I think even though they're talking about dyscalculia, I think if we see where some of that overlap is, that should give us a lot of optimism for CVI, for kids with CVI and their ability to develop the math ability too. This research here shows that where you start doesn't mean that's where you finish. It just means that intervention has to be targeted to that starting point. Okay, I promised like 2 slides or something like that left. We're like basically done, and I'm not going through all of this. Don't worry. But I wanted to just show you this so you could always come back and look at it later if you want. I kind of made a table that in my mind sort of summarized this whole presentation just in how I'm thinking about, in my own mind, CVI and math, right? I feel like if we think of the 10 characteristics and the CVI range, the difficulties with math in general come down to visual complexity, specifically difficulty with array and difficulty with complexity of target. And then in the next column, I give sort of descriptions of both of these and how the neurological literature relates. And that's so we can look them up and see how they've been studied in other fields. And then what are the potential math areas impacted? And I say potential because I'm just learning this too. And then what are potential supports for some kids, the overall supports that might help with these areas? And then in general, across all these areas, what are sort of like the main themes that I've tried to relate today? And the one last thing is that I feel like when I'm thinking of math and I'm thinking of my students with CVI, I picture an iceberg. And I picture that at the top of the iceberg, you've got the question of, in the moment, does that student have access to a particular assignment? That's like when the teacher shows me the upcoming test and says, is this accessible for the student? And we color code it and we make spaces. Okay, now I think it's visually accessible. That's really important because the student can't show their knowledge of the cognitive aspects if it's not visually accessible, right? But that's just the tip of the iceberg. To me, what lies under that iceberg, under the tip of the iceberg, in the water part, is what's CVI's potential impact on math development in general? And how are we using the right teaching strategies? And are we keeping that in mind when we're developing teaching strategies for this student? And next steps for me are, I want to continue to read and research math in the brain-based visual impairments and think about how it might relate to my kids with CVI. I want to keep working with great math teachers and great special education teachers like Denise to try to share these insights and see what's working and why. And I want to read a book about dyscalculia and the teaching strategies and see if I notice more overlap with what's working for my students and maybe get more ideas of things I can try with my students. Not to worry about what the label is at all, not saying that dyscalculia is something that my student would have, but just like if they seem to come from similar areas, then maybe some of the strategies would be applicable as well. And then using the findings from the neurological literature, maybe from dyscalculia field, plus what we already know about CVI, to develop research questions specifically about our children and students with CVI aimed at math, and to really like explore that area for our field. And then finally, I want to filter what I've learned from other disciplines through a CVI conscious lens, firmly grounded in the CVI characteristics and CVI specific assessment and CVI specific interventions. And keep learning, basically, is what I want to do. And, you know, we were just talking about the idea of it would be great to have some sort of math study group. I think that's what our field needs, is some group where interested people that are parents, TVIs, math teachers, math coaches come together and just research our own little aspects that we're interested in and come together and write blog posts or do something that, you know, sort of start building a body of knowledge. And these are the resources that I used for this. Thank you so much for hanging in there. I probably went a little bit over time. I really appreciate it.
Wow, Matt, thank you so much. You can stop sharing your slides.
Okay.
I'm a little speechless right now. That was really incredible. Thank you. There's a lot of comments that came through that said, oh my God, this is so cool. This is awesome. This is gold.
Well, that's great.
Yeah, so it was amazing. Thank you so much.
Well, that's great. Thank you. And that's really, I'm really glad to know that, because this, you know, I've never presented on this before. These were things that were helping me with my students. And I was just hoping that it would sort of overlap somewhat with what some of you were noticing with your children too, and that it would apply somehow. So hopefully.
Yeah, there's a lot of comments that, you know, they're like, oh yeah, that's my kid. You know, and you're talking about counting and how kids with CVI count, how they double count or they miss counting. I'm like, oh, that's Henry every single time he counts.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of questions submitted, and there are a few that came up live. So should we just go into some parent questions?
Yeah, that would be great. And I just want to say ahead of time, I hope I can answer your questions. And again, I'm not a math teacher. I'm just sort of learning I'm relatively early on this journey myself. So I'll do my best. But if I don't know the answer, I'm definitely not going to try to pretend I do, even though that's like tempting sometimes, because I don't want to do that. So
oh, that's great. That's wonderful. So a parent early on asked, my question has to do with teaching concepts versus identification. If a student can count and even do addition with manipulatives, but cannot identify the actual numerals, where is the balance? When do you progress with concepts and maybe verbal only or dictated answers, or decide to double down on trying to memorize numerals and other math symbols?
okay, yeah. I mean, if we're thinking about, I can basically, when I answer, I'll imagine that it's my student that I'm thinking about, just to keep in mind that it's just my opinion. But if that were, I mean, I know exactly what you're saying and what you mean, I think there. And I guess what I would lean toward saying that we don't want that difficulty with, we don't want that. We know that math is multimodal, right? Like we've seen that in the research. And I wouldn't want one isolated visual ability of being able to identify numerals to be a bottleneck for math development, right? I mean, you can have a person, I mean, there's lots of different ways to approach math. And I would say, like, maybe you don't want to abandon learning numbers, but maybe you want to do something like a balance where you're using auditory and tactile means to go forward with the concepts, but you're meeting the student where they visually are at with identifying the numbers, but you're not making one dependent on the other. You know, and I almost like, I think about that way with reading too. I've had students who are auditorily comprehending written text, grade level, but not yet able to identify letters. I mean, yeah, letters and words, but we don't want to just like having them stop reading, you know, so we want to use the auditory text to enhance their comprehension, and to keep going and keep developing their auditory comprehension and their reading comprehension that way, but also still working on letters at the same time, but not making one reliant on the other or a prerequisite of the other.
I love that analogy to reading. That makes total sense. Concept development doesn't have to be totally linear, right? It can just be,
you
know, really individualized to the student. That's beautiful. So I know you know Dagbjörn. She's an individual CVI in Iceland. She was here listening, and she said, "Hi, Matt. Awesome to meet you."
That's awesome.
I wonder, since I have both CVI and dyscalculia, is having these two together common? I have difficulty explaining to people that I have both things and how it affects me, both similarly and differently. Thank you for your presentation. I think you mentioned this towards the end of your presentation.
Yeah, Dagbjörn, thank you for being here. That's wonderful. I don't know. I mean, that's something, that's definitely a question worth asking, I think. You know, I don't know what the answer would be, but the question I would ask myself is, you know, because when I read the definitions of dyscalculia, like sort of informally on blog posts and teacher web pages, it basically just says dyscalculia it's kind of a vague definition. You know, it's sort of like difficulty with math disproportionate to your other abilities. You know, a person could be a great reader but have trouble with math. But, you know, from what I've seen, the specifics of it, as far as where scientists think it arises, as far as like the neurology of it, it seems to have a lot in common with visual complexity and developing that visual sort of number sense area. So I mean, I think that's it's such a great question. I wouldn't know how to answer it, but I think that's the type of questions that we have to be asking. Right. I mean, is it part of the same thing to some extent? I mean, like if someone's parietal lobe is affected by something, that can give you visual difficulties, also potentially math difficulties from what we're seeing. And from at what point do you separate them? I don't know, but I think it's a great question. That might be one of the areas to explore.
Absolutely.
In Dagbjörn, if you ever want to be a part of this study group that we're thinking of, I mean, that would be incredible.
I'm all in for the math study group. Can't wait. Yeah, we just need more research. I mean, this is like you said earlier, this is the very first kind of big presentation on math and CVI, and you've just dove into all the research, which we're just also grateful for. But this is just the beginning, right?
Yeah, just sort of asking the questions, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Another parent asked, do you have suggestions for students who are nonverbal?
Yeah. So I'm trying to figure out what I don't want to. So the student who, I don't think I gave her a name during the presentation, but it's the student who I was showing Denise's materials with, the auditory, the tactile, and all that. She's a great communicator, but non-verbally. Has a phenomenal system of yes, no's, using the pod system with auditory scanning and everything. And she's just like, I mean, the stuff that, so she can give us a sense of yes and no. And so Denise makes amazing use of that by organizing the lessons in a way that the student can respond to it. But you don't have to be verbal to understand math, even if I have other students who we're not sure yet how to, because of maybe motor issues and stuff, sort of we're still working on trying to figure out how we can help them communicate and show us a yes, no response. But the studies have found that pre-verbal, and I'm going to say when we're all, even before we can speak, way back, I mean, back to a few months old, we're already able to do addition and subtraction without numbers, without numerals, without the ability to speak. There's been studies where they'll have like a 3 or 4 month old infant, and they'll have, let's say, 2 dolls. and then they'll put a thing over it, like a cover over it, and then pull it away, and there's still two dolls. So babies tend to look at things more when they're surprised, and they try to figure it out. So the child expects two dolls still, so they don't look. And then if you put the occluder over there again and you add one and you pull it away, if they see three, then they don't look that much because they're not surprised. They expected to see an additional one there. But if you pull the occluder away after adding another one and there's only one, the baby stares at it like, what on earth just happened? Now, of course, if you have CVI, that type of visual access to math might be difficult. But what it shows is that it's possible to develop this number sense from a really early age, and it's not dependent on having verbal language. So yeah, I would say, the types of thing, the tactile, the visual, the auditory, kind of combining it all. And I would say, for if a student's, like for some of my students, what we'll do things like really incorporating math skills like calendars and first, next, and then, and finished and all done and left to right. And that kind of like early sort of math development, will incorporate it into their daily schedule by using objects of reference. So a student might have an object to represent the first activity of their day, and then the second activity of their day, and the third activity. And those objects are real objects that they use in those activities right at the beginning to make the connection. And then eventually graduate to a three compartment divider where here's what we have first, here's what we have next, here's what we have after that. They can look at it, they can explore each one tactily, and then they're putting the item in an all done box when they're finished. So that's just like one small way to take sort of early visual spatial literacy and math concepts to a place that relates to the person and where they are in their daily lives. Just like the research showed for the patients with simultaneognosia, when it related to their daily life, they were able to understand it better. So that's, I think, another place where I would try to go often is where's the student at in their daily life, and how can we maybe simultaneously enhance their understanding of what's coming first, what's coming next, in being able to anticipate their day or being able to anticipate the steps in an activity, and then maybe counting first step, second step, third step, but actually like having objects and images and wherever they're at visually to go with it to strengthen that understanding as well.
Exactly. I love it. I mean, context is so important I know for Henry and for many kids with CVI. If it's not meaningful, it's not rooted in anything that is meaningful to them, it's so difficult. And I lost what I was going to say, so I'm going to move on. But yeah, that's great. So there was a question about, let me find it. If a child has dyslexia and dyscalculia, both, should they be looking at visual processing or CVI? That's a big question. That's a good question to ask,
Yeah, I mean, to me, it would go down to the individual assessment. If you suspect CVI, I would, find, I mean, it often, I would find maybe an eye doctor who's well in CVI, who you can go to, who can give you, who can sort of look at the evidence with you, kind of partner with you, and really, I think some of the doctors that I know who are really interested in CVI and understand it a lot realize that the information that the parent has holds a lot of the information needed to make the diagnosis. It's not just a clinical diagnosis. And so I think a doctor that's going to take a lot of time to ask you those questions and maybe use one of the inventories like by Els Ortobus to teach CVI, or the Dutton Visual Skills Inventory, places that are already using inventories like that, to me, they would be much more likely to catch the CVI and diagnose it. But yeah, I would say, and then you want like really good functional CVI-based functional vision assessment. I always, my foundation is the CVI range. There are, from the cerebral visual impairment literature, there are some functional vision protocols too that go more by like dorsal stream, ventral stream, sort of going from the ocular back to the brain and everything. And those can be really useful too. I've used those for some of my students as well. So I think it's which one is the best match for your student. If I had a student who I suspected CVI and they also had dyscalculia, I would be working with these professionals like the eye doctor that knows CVI. I'd be working with the math coaches to try to figure out, is this, what visual components might be here. But I would certainly, I think based on what I've read now and what I know now, it would make some red flags go up maybe that I should look into that could it be some CVI as well. But also you want to look for those other characteristics as well.
Right. So multiple approaches, multiple team members, multiple assessments to figure
Yeah,
out. Yeah. I'm going to go to some of our earlier submitted questions.
sure.
So let's talk about time. Oh, time is so tough for many kids.
So abstract, yeah.
Yeah, it's very abstract to my child with CVI, telling time, the passage of time, and so on. Do you have any recommendations for visual aids that can help solidify the concept? My child is in phase 3 for reference.
Well, I'm afraid I might not have much past the what you might have already looked at and tried. So some of my students have benefited from the clocks, the type of clocks that show the that use color. You know, so you've got the clocks that are automated, physical clocks, and as like the hour and minute hands go, sort of a red trail comes out from behind them. Whatever time is passed is now colored red, and whatever time is in front is still white. You know, so it sort of gives this nice visual passage of time. So that's been sort of a go-to for a couple of my students. My sense is that, you know, a lot of people, if you're asking that question, you may have already explored that. But I would say like also visual schedules, tactile schedules, schedules that are tactile and visual or just visual. For my students in phase 3, it would typically be more of a visual schedule. But so a couple of my students are using apps where I forget the name of it, but it's this one particular app where you have like images for what you have a row for what you haven't done yet, like your schedule for the day, and then a row next to it, a column next to it for what you've already done, like checking it off. And the student slides the pictures from like, okay, I just did that. I'm going to slide it over to done. Now what's next? And that when we're talking about passage of time, I feel like those types of visuals can be phenomenal. That might not, you can maybe pair that with instruction on what time of day it also is too. You know, maybe you're using that app, and if the child really likes it, if your child likes using that type of strategy, and they're saying, okay, I just did gym, now that's over, and they're dragging it to the over column, maybe after everything is over, each activity is over, during that transition, you or the teacher takes out the clock with the colored hands and all that stuff and kind of shows, okay, you know, we always end math at 2. See, it's 2 o'clock. Here's the blue hand. Here's the red hand. And now we're going to do speech. Speech is always at 2:10 or whatever. Now let's move this to the 10. You know, so I would say, again, grounding it in their daily schedule and showing the passage of time based on visual schedules, maybe aren't on a clock, but then maybe comparing it to the clock. But I feel like a lot of it would still come back down to maybe color. You know, I feel like color helps my students get a lot of concepts. So even if you had his schedule arranged, you know, linearly for the day, even if it was like, here's the 3 activities I'm doing before lunch, and there was like a linear, almost red bar or something, or whatever, if there's a certain color he likes, or it could be any color, that you sort of drag to each activity as it's done. And then more and more of that bar becomes red until you get to lunch, sort of seeing that passage of time. And I don't know, just that type of visual spatial organization in the context of their daily schedule might help. That's what I would try with some of my kids.
That's a great idea. I want to try that with Henry. I love it. I'm going to look at through some of the questions. As many which that were submitted, you answered pretty well in your presentation. So just give me a moment. I want to just scroll through. So my son has trouble with addition and subtraction because he does not understand, I believe, the quantity of objects a number holds. How can I support him with this skill?
Yeah, I would. So I mean, you know, of course, it's tough to answer question. It's a great question. It's a hard for me to answer specifically, just because like I would usually plan these things for students after I've done a significant amount of assessment and everything. But just sort of in a general standpoint, I'm almost going to be like imagining one of my students, you know, is sort of like what I would do if it were them, I guess. Is I think I would go like really rely heavily on that multisensory approach, and with manipulatives and with like things that are going to mean something, you know, almost like I was thinking about that, like that goofy waiter and customer routine that we did with DJ, something like where it's almost like, I don't know, I wouldn't like, so let's just, I'm just thinking out loud here, but let's say like, instead of, let's say he ordered 5 Pirates booty, but I brought him 4, you know, and he's like, there's only 4 there, you know, or something. And then, well, 4 plus what equals 5? I don't know, you know what I mean? Like maybe there's way, and then he's touching Pirates booty, he's counting it, he's naming it, he's feeling and he's tasting the quantity, you know, like that's sort of the type, if the struggles seem to be really conceptual like that, times that's sort of the route I would take, like manipulatives and visual, something that's really like going to grab the students' motivation and just really make them like it, and something that's fun that doesn't feel like work, and something that almost has like a story around it. You know, like why the reason why we do the waiter thing is it's because like, well, why are you taking some away? Why are you giving me 4 instead of 5? You know, like to me, if there's a reason, like, hey, I ordered 5, you gave me 4, where's that extra one? All of a sudden, to me, it becomes real, like a real concept. You know, another one could be real functional daily activities like setting the table or something like that. You know, like for a student who does have difficulty figuring out what 4 is, you know, maybe setting the table for their peers at lunch at first with a very specific, like, so at first I might have a placemat at each place with really visually simple, color-coded spots of where to put the fork, where to put the spoon, where to put the plate, depending on the student's ability to handle complexity. And then have like, maybe first give the student the spoons and only have 4 in there. Make it errorless, you know, only have 4 in there. And then like they're going to each placemat and looking, say, okay, spoons are red, find this. So they're looking for each red spot on the placemat, putting each spoon there, that one-to-one correspondence. Maybe after they've mastered that, you're giving them the thing with spoons with 6, and they've got to realize that they've reached the end and that they're bringing 2 back, you know? So, or like you give them one with 3 and they need 1 more, and just things like that. So I don't know, like your individual child, that may or may not even be where they are, but that's sort of like the type of approach I would probably try taking and see if it helps.
Do you see over time that after you do this type of work, this multisensory work, that they're able to apply it as they grow older and more additional math concepts? Can you take those scaffolds away?
Oh yeah. Like so for what did I name him here? Aiden. So the student that I called Aiden in this presentation used like with the dinosaur manipulatives. So that was him in kindergarten. That was first part of first grade maybe. A lot of manipulatives to count. And there's nothing wrong with manipulatives. I mean, I've had much older kids who still benefit from using manipulatives, and do more advanced math with manipulatives. But for him, you know, like if you were to go into his classroom today, you'd see him doing math equations written on the iPad, like 4 times 6, 4 plus 4. You know, he'd have things like, you know, the number 4 and the number 10, and then he'd have to move like the greater than or the lesser than sign into the right spot. So he's, you know, gone from like having difficulty counting manipulatives to being able to do printed math problems, no problem now, as long as there's one problem at a time. You know, so yeah, certainly. Just students who move sort of, I had students like he's an example of a kid who moved from only being able to recognize words with the bubble outline, like that was critical in helping him learn how to read sight words, to eventually graduating where it was only new words that he needed, novel words that he needed outlined, to eventually no words, even novel words now he learns without the outlines. But it was like, and I've noticed a similar pattern with manipulatives for him. When he did a science thing last year when we were still in person that was like velocity. They were studying velocity. So that was an example. Like maybe he's not using manipulatives for addition anymore right now. But when it comes to like velocity and, you know, speed and angles and all that, there's no way we were just giving that to him visually. So we built a ramp. We had a little matchbox cars that we'd play with and, you know, like adjust the angle of the ramp. How many books are we going to put under it and stuff? So I think like manipulatives can always be good at different points. And then hopefully they teach on stuff where you might not even need the manipulatives eventually.
I think we all need a manipulative to understand.
Yeah. Like especially if you're learning a new concept.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. Okay. So let me look at this question that just came in. Because basic addition, subtraction, multiplication has been so challenging for my son, our team has been kicking around the idea of scrapping manual math at 11 and turning to calculator. Is it possible to strike a balance in learning math manually and visually and performing calculations on a device? Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm just making sure I heard the question right. So he's doing math on the he can do the manual math is tricky. He can do math on the calculator, and it sounds like what you're wondering is, you know, you don't want is it okay to move on to more different concepts using the calculator rather than let the manual math difficulties be like sort of a bottleneck toward math learning? And I would say, yeah, like I think again, not knowing the person, it's harder to say
Right.
specific, but if he were my student, I'd probably advise the team that, you know, there's, possibly reason to keep working on some forms of manual math. Maybe there's more of an accessible way to do it somehow. But if the concepts are sort of outstripping the ability to do manual math, or you don't want the manual math difficulties to weigh down his ability to keep moving forward in the concepts, I would say, yeah, like use whatever creative, auditory, visual, tactile types of ways you can do it to get the concepts, just like with reading comprehension versus words.
Right.
And but maybe, and I don't know, this is the kind of thing where I might talk to the child's OT and they say, oh my gosh, no, he hates writing and he cries every time and we've been doing it for years, and he, versus he likes it, but he's just having trouble with it. So I don't know, without knowing all those details, but I would say just in general, I would always explore with the team, is there any reason not to continue working on the manual calculations and everything? And it would have to be a pretty good reason, I would think, because how long have they been doing it for? Is it really adversive to them? Does the student really not like it? Is it that kind of thing? Or how early is it in their attempts? If the person's only been trying it for 6 months or a year versus 10 years, that might matter too. Or, but yeah, I would say maybe try, definitely go forward with the concepts in my mind. And, sort of explore, is there a good reason not to keep going on a sort of a parallel path with the calculations too?
Yeah, it almost makes me think of it, there needs to be like an AT assessment, something that removes some barriers. If it's like you said, or if it's a motor issue with writing. Again, we don't know this child. I think of one student, or one CVI child. He, uses the iPad just to do all the worksheets just because writing's really hard. So I wonder if that's just a way to do manual math.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah, I like how you just mentioned, are we really making sure we're addressing all of the barriers to access before totally getting rid of it? So great. Okay, let's see. You've provided a lot of examples of how to modify work for students with CVI. And, I think you've addressed, I know I have this issue with Henry, like one-to-one counting is still so hard for him, but, he's moving on to addition, subtraction. And you've addressed this, you just addressed this, but, we don't want that to be a gatekeeper for learning new concepts.
Yeah. And I just want to stress too, that the math teachers and the math coaches and a lot of the special education teachers probably in your children's school know way more about math than I do, right? It's like the people, Denise, the people that I work with, they could run circles around me and the understanding of how math develops and how to teach it. Yeah. But I think what it is taking the knowledge of how math can be impacted by CVI and then combining that with their knowledge of how sort of what good teaching strategies are and stuff too, to kind of come up with something that meets. So yeah, I would always, is like, whenever I might have the question, well, geez, like, why would we stop doing, physical, like actually writing out the calculations? Is there a reason to? I would talk to the OT, the parent, I'd talk to this math teacher, and, maybe there's compelling reasons not to, but it's always like, I bring the knowledge that I'm gaining in CVI in math and sort of like combine that with the math coach or the teacher's knowledge and how to really teach math. And we sort of come up hopefully with a good collaboration that helps the student.
All about that collaboration.
Yeah.
I love it. And, for part 2 of CVI and math, which clearly we need, maybe we should have you and a special educator and math teacher on here as well. That'd be great.
That could be great. Yeah. I mean, that's hearing from a person who really teaches math, like to a person with CVI and has had success with it. Like what are they, like almost like a case study,
Okay, it's planned. Let me just look at a few more questions. Are you okay for time?
Yeah, sure.
And going good.
Well, it was my fault. I have like 115 slides, so
love it. You've been so generous
to stick with me for that long. I'm fine sticking with you guys for however long you want.
So grateful. Okay. You've talked about incorporating problem-solving skills in everyday routines, and I also loved how you gave an example of how to do it in school. Everyone's like, "Oh, that's at home," but you can bring that right into school. There's no reason not to bring.
Yeah, totally.
And I don't know. This is a very specific one about getting through the math section on the SATs.
Mm-hmm.
Are you? You're like,
Yeah,
I don't know.
I know. It's yeah, the math section on the SATs.
Are you working with any um, kids with CBI who are attempting the SAT or any type of those standardized tests?
No, so I don't have an answer for this, but what I can, because so I've had Braille readers that have taken the SATs before,
Mhm.
Braille accommodations for it. But what
Okay.
are the CVI accommodations, right? I mean,
Oh,
if the student needs color coding, extra spacing, one problem at a time, like where's all that? That's what I keep sort of running into, that question.
okay.
What I would say, I guess what I can do is give you an example of one of my students who's been very successful in her post-secondary education. And not that I'm saying not that I'm saying we want to, really what we should be doing is making somehow so the SATs can be more accessible for kids with CVI. I think that's the long term. When it comes to individual students, my particular student decided that, she just didn't want to take the SATs. She didn't feel like it would be she didn't feel like it would be a good representation of what she knew. She felt it would undersell her when she was looking at colleges. So she didn't do it. And I'm not recommending that as a strategy. Don't do the SATs. But for her, I'll just say what the process was like for her. In our state, at least, there's multiple colleges that don't require SATs anymore. It's becoming more of a trend. I think the trend is starting to be where people are realizing more and more that that sort of static one attempt look at what cognition is or what a person's intellect is isn't maybe in this era of growth mindset and realizing how much plasticity and how people can learn and show their learning in different ways. Maybe it's not the best one size fits all description of what a person knows and what they're going to be able to do for society, right? And so we have colleges, really good colleges that don't look at SATs anymore. And they accept you based on your grades, based on who you are and what you've done, and things like that. She got into a very good school, and she is on the honor roll. She's living in honors housing. She's doing like a bazillion extracurricular activities, studying abroad. I'm just like, I get dizzy every time I talk to her, just because I'm like, I don't even know how I wouldn't be able to handle all that stuff. And that's not to say, it may be that your child has his heart set on a school that does need SATs. And I don't know what to say about that, except that, I haven't had a student take SATs in so long. And actually, when I had Braille readers, they were only taking PSATs, that I can't really even remember what the process was for talking to the SAT board, what accommodations were possible, what accommodations weren't possible. But I guess I'll just say that there are colleges out there and universities that don't require them anymore, and that look more at your overall achievement.
Yeah. Yeah. But it sounds
But
like
you may want to get into a certain program that does. And I think that's an area where, like I know our state assessments do a great job at from what I understand, do a great job at accommodating Braille readers, but don't have really the steps that it takes to make our state assessments accessible for kids with CVI. So that's something that has to change. Now so many students are opting out, but that can't always just be it's not accessible, so we have to opt out. That's not an acceptable.
No, it's not.
But it's kind of where it is right now.
Yeah. Oh, that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah.
All right. One more question.
Sure.
So you've talked a little bit about geometry. So I would love suggestions for how to make measuring and geometry concepts accessible for a child in phase 2. For instance, my son needs to look at a graph with various shapes on it and count square units. And okay, that's the first part of the question. So have you answered that? And there's a second part.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a great question. So that reminds me of some of the work that I was doing with that student, like where I showed you the model of the prism and everything. And she's run into some of these issues. And what I'm picturing when you say like the geometric shapes on the grid is that you've got these geometric shapes and they're like overlaid on top of a grid with squares on it. And the person has to tell like, how many squares long is it? How many units tall is it? And then like calculate the area and stuff like that. So what we've done sometimes for that student is an accommodation that her ability to understand how to find the area of a rectangle should have nothing to do with her ability to visually perceive an incredibly complex grid of squares. They're two different skills. And for typically sighted individuals, it's an easy skill, the visual part. So you can just do it that way. But for my student with CVI, the visual part would be a bottleneck for her being able to show that she understands how to find the area of a rectangle. So what we did was we just had them, instead of having a rectangle that takes up 8 squares by 4 squares, we just get rid of the grid, have them put a rectangle there, and just have them write 8 and 4. Right? It's just the same. Like, to me, a typically sighted person's ability to see the 4 squares that's giving them the answer of how long the side is, just as much as it is to show the numeral to my student, right? Because we're not testing, can you figure out how long the side is? We're testing if you know the length of the side, and if you know the length of the length, I guess, then you know how to, then you can show whether you can multiply them or not and find the area. So I feel like sometimes it's just that accommodation, is looking at it as, is the visual complexity in the task inherently necessary for the child to the purpose of the task, you know? And in that case, if the purpose is to find the area of the square, you can do that by just having the numbers without that grid, and you can still show you know how to calculate the area of a square or a rectangle. So I would say, is the complexity piece absolutely necessary and essential for the concept? I mean, if it's not, get rid of it, and just you know, someone could be modifying these and have it be where it's just the square with just the numbers on it. And then as far as measuring and stuff like that, you know, I don't know if you're specifically thinking about like rulers and that type of thing, but same student, one difficulty she had, whether she was measuring an image on a piece of paper and holding a ruler up to it, or whether she was measuring like an object and holding a ruler up to it, one of the things she had difficulty with was lining up the lines on the ruler with the beginning and end edges of the picture or the object. And if she was off with that, she was off with her measurement. So one of the things that we did was like put little tactile things. In her case, we used popsicle sticks one time, but it could be any pencils, popsicle sticks, something precise enough, depending on how precise you need the measurements to be. And putting it at a perpendicular, at a 90-degree angle to the ruler, in sliding them like right to like, so basically like sliding them down the ruler until they meet the beginning and end of the object, or until they meet the beginning and end of the picture. And then that way you're lining up the lines on the ruler and you're seeing where they're supposed to be. Now, sometimes she's been getting things like, she'll get, when they're doing more precise measurements like millimeters, right? That's hard. I mean, even if you have a millimeter, you can't make millimeters bigger, you know, and more space, because they got to be millimeters. But can you make millimeters bigger? Can you show like we've never tried this. I'm kind of taking a diversion for a second, but could you show the actual picture with the actual millimeter ruler next to it? It's just so she has the concept of how small it is, but then blow up another one and have there be much more space and say, this is a zoomed in version of the millimeters. And now we're going to draw a dotted line from each of the start and end points of the picture to the right points on the ruler. And you tell me what the points are. Because to me, a student shouldn't be penalized in their grade or their performance if they have trouble lining up the edge of the object or image with the lines. But there are creative ways to help them independently even do that, like with rulers and stuff.
Because both examples for the geometry measuring, it's about the math, it's about the equation, right? And so if visually they're, you know, as long as they have the information they need to solve the equation, they're showing their math skills.
Yeah. And to me, like a lot of times with the measurement, I don't know, I don't have a ton of students who are like at that grade level and at that specific point where they're doing that yet. But from what I've seen, like they don't stay on measurement for a long time. Usually they're using it as a segue to then talk about like measurement conversions, like feet to centimeters or inches to, you know, whatever, yards to feet and stuff like that. So I feel like once they get to that point, if the visual difficulty is in the actual measuring of it, you know, 4.2 millimeters or something like really hard to measure because of complexity of array, then maybe that's another example where if the concept is to try to convert meters to inches, can you just give them the measurement as a full accommodation, and they've still got to demonstrate the concept of the conversion, but you're just giving them the measurement. And then for certain real life things like measuring a cup of flour, or you know, maybe that kind of thing, you want to really teach compensatory strategies for visual or tactile, because that's more necessary, you know. But you know, measuring like a, you know, pencil in millimeters might not be the most real world functional thing. Maybe you can just give them the measurement if the point of the activity is to do the conversions and stuff or comparisons.
Exactly. Okay. Last question.
Sure.
So any tips for doing longer addition, subtraction problems for 3+ digits for a child who can't physically write out a problem? My son has to do all his math in his head, but it gets harder as the numbers get bigger.
Yeah, that would make sense. I'm trying to sort of picture it. Yeah, and I read this question. You know, it makes me think of, I think it's certainly possible to do multi-digit problems, you know, in that sort of like without writing it, without verbalizing it and everything. I think I wish I could sort of see like what the screen looks like currently, what, you know, like what how the shapes are arranged and or what's sort of like what it looks like. So I don't really, you know, I would say if you want to like, you know, email me some screenshots or something like that, or, you know, ask some specific questions about it. I could try to help that way. It's a little hard. I know what you mean. Like I know what your question is, but like without knowing the child and seeing what it already looks like, it would be a little bit hard to kind of say or even give any ideas. But yeah, I think it's possible. And like many of my, like, you know, the examples that the teacher Denise is doing, that student's doing it all without writing and doing it non-verbally. You know, so it's certainly something that is, I think, a good way to do it. But as far as like the specifics of it, yeah, feel free, Rachel, you could share my email or something like that with that person.
Or yeah, I'll reach out to this mom. I know who it is and share your email. I'm sure she would love it. Okay. I think it's dinner time. Oh my goodness, Matt. Thank you so much. It's just,
yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. This is
oh my God.
This is great what you guys are doing. And you know, I think really parents are, you know, there's a lot of people working hard in this field, but parents are moving the field forward, you know, and anytime that parents would take their time away from everything else they're doing to like listen to information I have to share, I really appreciate it.
Oh, of course. Well, we appreciate you being so generous with your time. And just what I love about your contribution to the field is you dive into the research, you really believe in diversity of thought, and you bring it all together to really make it practical and applicable for our kids with CVI. So thank you for that. I really
thank you. You're welcome. Yeah.
And yeah, I'm ready for part 2 of math and CVI. I'm ready for the math study group. Let's figure this out.
Sounds good.
Thank you all who joined, who stayed with us. Please, again, check out cvinow.org for all you need to know about CVI. And this recording will be posted there soon. So thank you, Matt. Enjoy.
Thank you very much. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Thank you so much for watching this event brought to you by CVI Now here at Perkins School for the Blind. Go to cvinow.org to learn more.